At WWII on March 7, 1945, the war in Western Europe found a door that was supposed to be locked. The door was a steel railway bridge at Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge. It stretched over the Rhine, from the West Bank town of Remagen to the cliffs and tunnel mouths of Erpel on the east side, and it should not have been standing. German officers had prepared for this moment for years. The Rhine was not just water on a map. It was the line behind all the other lines, the final barrier, the river every retreat was supposed to end at, the place where a broken army could still say, "Here, geography will fight for us." But that afternoon, Major Hans Scheller had a problem no staff map had solved for him. His orders gave him minutes to destroy the bridge after American troops appeared. Not hours, not a conference, minutes, and by the time the order reached him, American armor was already closing on the western approach. The clock had started too late. Scheller gave the demolition order. The charges went off. The bridge jumped. Smoke rolled across the steel. Timbers snapped loose and dropped into the river. For one suspended second, everyone on both banks waited for the great structure to fold. It did not fold. The bridge stayed up, and in that gap between what was supposed to happen and what actually happened, an American lieutenant made a decision that no Allied plan had scheduled. He crossed. Not tomorrow. Not after engineers built pontoons. Not after headquarters rewrote the operation. Right then, 30 seconds was enough. The Rhine had been the German army's last natural argument. At Remagen, one damaged bridge turned that argument into a question, and American soldiers answered it with their boots. To understand why Remagen mattered, you have to understand what the Rhine meant in March of 1945. By then, Germany was losing everywhere. The Ardennes offensive had failed. The Western armies were pushing through the Rhineland. Cities were falling. Divisions were shrinking into fragments. But the Rhine still carried a dangerous hope for German command. It was wide, cold, fast, difficult to bridge under fire. And at Remagen, it was guarded by terrain that seemed built for defense. The river ran below cliff faces and steep approaches. The Erpeler Lay rose high above the eastern bank, giving defenders a view over the bridge and the water. The bridge itself was a long, exposed steel skeleton. A man crossing it could be seen almost the entire way. Machine guns could sweep it. Artillery could bracket it. Anti-aircraft guns could be lowered and used against infantry. Engineers had wired it for demolition. On paper, this was not an opportunity. It was a trap, and Allied planners knew it. The deliberate crossing of the Rhine was supposed to happen elsewhere, with enormous preparation, under controlled conditions, with bridging equipment, artillery schedules, air cover, smoke screens, and a logistics plan big enough to push an army across a major river. That was how you crossed the Rhine, not by chasing dust into a town, seeing a bridge still alive, and deciding in the open daylight to run across it. But war punishes the side that needs the world to behave exactly as planned. By the morning of March 7, Combat Command B of the U.S. 9th Armored Division was advancing toward the river. Its mission was simple enough. Reach the Rhine, secure the West Bank. Wait, nobody expected to find a usable bridge. The Germans had blown bridge after bridge during the withdrawal. Every assumption said Remagen would be another dead crossing site. Another gap to mark on a map while engineers prepared the real assault somewhere else. Then an American reconnaissance element reached high ground overlooking the town, and there it was. Steel arches, twin towers, rail line, still standing over the Rhine. The report moved fast because every officer who heard it understood the same thing. A standing bridge over the Rhine was not a local surprise. It was a strategic emergency wearing a tactical uniform. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann pushed forces toward the bridge. Brigadier General William Hogue grasped what the discovery meant. Taking it was risky. Waiting was worse. Because bridges do not stay available while men debate permission. German engineers were still trying to finish the demolition. German defenders were still trying to hold the approaches. The bridge was damaged, mined, and under fire. But it was standing. That was the whole argument. At the front of the assault was Lieutenant Karl Timmermann of Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. He was young, 22. An American officer with a German-born father, standing before a German bridge over the river that Germany had built into a national boundary of the mind. His company was under strength. The approach was cratered. Smoke and dust hung in the air from the failed blast. Some of the demolition charges were still there. The steelwork could have collapsed under him. The enemy was still shooting. Every sensible military instinct said this was the moment to wait for confirmation, for engineers, for clearer orders, for someone senior to own the consequence. Timmermann did not wait. He ordered the assault. Sergeant Alexander Drabik and other men of the lead elements started across the bridge under fire. They moved over hundreds of feet of exposed steel, with the river flashing below them. They ducked behind girders, ran when the fire lifted, dropped again when machine guns found the span. German rounds cracked through the superstructure. American tank guns and machine guns fired from the west bank to suppress the defenders. Engineers moved into the smoke and began ripping out wires and charges while infantry pushed forward. This was not cinematic confidence. It was organized urgency. The men crossing did not know the bridge would hold. They did not know the charges were truly dead. They did not know whether the East Bank could be seized before German defenders recovered. What they knew was narrower and more powerful. The bridge was still there, and nobody was going to give them a better bridge 5 minutes later. By evening, American troops had a foothold on the east side of the Rhine. By night, the crossing was no longer a raid. It was becoming a bridgehead. By the next day, thousands of American soldiers had gone across. The German High Command had spent years imagining the Rhine as an interval, a pause forced by nature, a place where the Allied advance would have to stop, reorganize, and expose itself to counterattack. Remagen destroyed the interval, not because the Americans had planned the perfect crossing there, because they had found an imperfect crossing and exploited it faster than the German system could react. That is the part of the story that matters most. The failed demolition was only the opening. The real blow was what happened after the bridge failed to fall. German commanders tried to comprehend the report. A bridge across the Rhine, still standing? American troops already on the East Bank? It sounded less like an operational update than a violation of the rules the campaign had been using. The Rhine was supposed to be defended from prepared positions. Crossing it was supposed to require an operation so visible that German reserves could be shifted toward it. Instead, a local commander's opportunity became an army-level fact in a matter of hours. And once the Americans were across, they did what modern armies do when their system works. They fed the opening, more infantry, more ammunition, more engineers, more anti-aircraft guns, more vehicles, more bridge equipment. The first men had crossed on damaged steel, but the army behind them turned that steel into a pipeline. For 10 days, The Ludendorff Bridge remained both miracle and target. German forces threw almost everything they could at it: artillery, air attacks, sabotage attempts, floating mines. Later, even long-range weapons were used in the effort to smash the crossing. The bridge was hit, shaken, strained, and battered. Traffic pounded across it. Engineers worked constantly under danger. The structure was wounded from the original failed demolitions and from every attack that followed. On March 17, it finally collapsed into the Rhine. But by then it was too late. The bridge had already done its job. American engineers had built other crossings. Pontoon bridges and replacement bridges carried the flow. The bridgehead east of the Rhine had expanded. What had begun as a few men running through smoke had become a permanent breach in the western wall of Germany. That is why the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge was not a German victory. It was the sound of a door breaking after the army had already passed through. The German reaction reveals the true scale of the shock. Hitler did not respond by admitting that the Western defense had been overtaken by speed. He responded with punishment. Officers connected to the failed demolition were hauled before a flying court-martial. Several were executed. The regime treated the standing bridge as a moral crime, because that was the only language it had left for a military disaster it could not undo. But executions could not put steel back into the river. They could not rewind the afternoon. They could not restore the Rhine as a psychological boundary. The officers were dead, the bridgehead was alive, and that difference said everything. The German army still had men who would fight. It still had guns that could fire. It still had units capable of local counterattack. But after Remagen, its defensive logic was broken. Every remaining line now carried a new fear. What if the Americans did not pause where they were supposed to pause? What if a damaged bridge, a weak point, a confused withdrawal, or a missed demolition became the next Remagen? What if the interval between American discovery and American exploitation was no longer measured in days? What if it was measured in seconds? That fear mattered, because the German reserves committed around Remagen could not be everywhere else. Formations needed for future Rhine crossing battles were drawn toward the unexpected bridgehead. The Americans and British still carried out major planned crossings later in March. Patton crossed farther south. Montgomery launched Operation Plunder near Weasel. Those operations mattered. They were massive, deliberate, and successful. But Remagen had already changed the atmosphere in which they happened. The Rhine no longer stood as an intact promise. It had been crossed. The spell was broken. From the Remagen bridgehead, American forces helped drive the operations that would envelop the Ruhr. The Ruhr was not just another region. It was Germany's industrial heart. Its factories, rail lines, mines, and cities were part of what had kept the war machine alive. When Allied forces closed the Ruhr pocket in April, hundreds of thousands of German troops were trapped. Organized resistance in the West lost its last operational depth, and the path into central Germany opened wider with each day. That chain of events did not begin only at Remagen. No single bridge won the war. But Remagen accelerated the ending. It took a campaign built around planned crossings and inserted a rupture 2 weeks early. It forced German command to fight where it had not chosen to fight. It gave the Allies ground east of the Rhine before the enemy could finish arranging the defense. And it proved that the American Army of 1945 was dangerous not only because of its tanks, artillery, aircraft, or supply columns. It was dangerous because lower-level leaders could recognize a moment and act before the moment disappeared. That is what made the bridge more than steel. The Germans had a system that demanded permission in the place where time was evaporating. The Americans had a system that sometimes allowed a lieutenant to turn opportunity into fact. That difference is easy to romanticize, so it has to be kept honest. The men at Remagen were not fearless. They were not acting inside a legend while they crossed. They were tired soldiers under fire, running across a damaged railway bridge, while demolition charges still threatened their lives. They were making practical decisions inside smoke, noise, and confusion. But history often turns on practical decisions made before the paperwork catches up. Timmermann did not need to know every strategic consequence. Drabik did not need to know what future historians would call him. The engineers pulling charges from the bridge did not need to know how the Ruhr pocket would close. They only needed to know that the bridge was still standing. And that was enough. The irony of Remagen is that the bridge had been built for German military movement in the First World War. Decades later, it became the route by which American soldiers entered the German heartland. A structure meant to serve one army's logistics became the failure point of another army's retreat. Its towers had watched years of preparation. They had seen charges placed, wires run, orders written, assumptions stacked on assumptions. Then, in one afternoon, those assumptions met a damaged circuit, a late order, and men who did not wait. There are battles remembered for the number of dead. Battles remembered for genius. Battles remembered for betrayal, endurance, or sacrifice. Remagen is remembered for a different reason. It is the story of a machine that failed to destroy itself on schedule, a river that lost its authority before sunset, and a decision small enough to fit inside half a minute, but large enough to move armies. By March 1945, Germany had almost nothing left except delay. Delay at rivers, delay at bridges, delay in towns, delay in forests, delay long enough for something impossible to happen in politics, in diplomacy, in the enemy coalition, anywhere. Remagen took one of those delays away, not slowly, not after a formal crossing order, not after weeks of preparation. In 30 seconds, Major Scheller pressed the war's last western barrier into motion, and the barrier failed. Lieutenant Timmermann saw the failure and stepped into it. Sergeant Drabik ran through it. Engineers held it open. Thousands followed. And the Rhine, the river that was supposed to make the Allies stop, became the road that proved they would not. The bridge should have been gone. It was not. So the Americans crossed it.